Welcome to the Autonomic Homeostasis Activation Podcast. I'm Tom Powles.
And I'm Ruth Lorensson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma to facilitate homeostasis.
Being free to experience wellness in body, mind, and spirit.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Good morning, Tom and Scott.
Good morning.
We are in this third conversation, and we actually never planned to have a third conversation originally. We asked Scott, a really good friend of ours and an expert in homeostasis, to come back into this podcast and have a couple of conversations with us around these big topics around homeostasis and purpose and niche construction theory and many little lives. And we've covered quite a lot in the last couple of conversations that we had. And at the end of the last conversation, after we recorded, we talked together and said, you know what, it would be really cool to have a conversation about AHA, which, the whole reason this podcast exists is because of autonomic homeostasis activation. It's a therapy that Tom has discovered and been implementing and training practitioners now for many years. And so Tom's going to share a little bit about, if you're really interested, you can go back into the podcast and there's many episodes about AHA. But for the purpose of this conversation, Tom, I'd really like us just to kind of do a quick overview of AHA, like what is going on there, and also just some of the outcomes, because one of the striking things for me as someone who's done AHA and been part of our little community that we have here in Colorado is that it works. It seems to work. Like it seems to have an impact on people. And there's been thousands of clients and other clients with other practitioners where you're seeing actually quite remarkable results. So where we're at with AHA at the moment is, we're on the cusp of trying to find more research and trying to figure out, what is actually happening in the brain and what is actually happening in the body when a client comes and does an AHA session. So we are thrilled, Scott, that you are going to throw your weight and kind of experience just to kind of basically say what you think could be happening. I mean, we don't know for sure, but from your experience. So we're excited about, there's a couple of parts to AHA that we will kind of go into. But for now, Tom, give us a little overview of maybe kind of AHA in simple layman's terms, like for me, and then also some of the outcomes that we've been seeing. And then maybe we can throw it over to Scott to kind of give your opinion on all of this.
Okay. This is going to be the 30,000 foot view very quickly. The reason for the name itself, autonomic, and it's about the autonomic nervous system, which has the sympathetic flight or fight, parasympathetic, which is very much involved in homeostasis, rest, relax, recover, and digest. And the third part is in the autonomic nervous system is the enteric nervous system. And that's all those neurons and glial cells that are in the digestive tract from about the lower third of the esophagus all the way through the rectum. And the glial cells and the neurons functioning very much the same way, but with different functions as the glial cells and neurons that are in the brain in the skull. It's just a different part, but it's the enteric nervous system. And I like to describe the enteric nervous system as survive and thrive, because the ratio of glial cells and neurons in the skull is a little less than 1-to-1, but in the enteric nervous system, it's 7-to-1. And glial cells vastly outnumber, and I like to describe glial cells as neuron nannies. They help those smart little neurons to function, and they would starve to death if they didn't have a nanny taking care of them, and they couldn't even function without it. What I discovered is that there is a way to, and I don't tell people how to do this because they would try and then their brain would do stuff, and with their mind they wouldn't know what to do with that. Hence, the practitioner is just a guide. And there is that activation of homeostasis, as we've talked a lot about that optimization, that normalization, that functioning, getting those many little lives conversations all on the same page and working harmoniously. But what I discovered is that while we can activate homeostasis in the autonomic nervous system, it requires a sensory experience, interoception, which are sensory awareness of somatic activity. Interoception, as I think of it and conceptualize it, is listening in to those many little lives conversations going on in our body. That's interoception, our sensory awareness of how do I feel, as was very famously put in that book by the author. Escaping me. Oh no.
Is it Bud Craig? No.
Yes, A.D. Bud Craig. Thank you. So how do I feel? And an interoceptive moment with your neurobiological self. And what I discovered is that if you combine that activation in the enteric nervous system of homeostasis and combine that with interoception, the results are extraordinary. Just to give you some examples, I have people rate their sense of stress, anxiety, depression, anger on a 0 to 10 scale. 0 is none, 10 is most severe. And if they don't interfere with the involuntary neurobiological process of homeostasis, those are all 0 at the end of that gradual, natural sensory process. 17 clients that I've done the MCMI, the Milan Clinical Multi-Actual Inventory, objective psychological assessment, where the clinical syndromes, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, major depression, these very significant mental health issues, when I administer the MCMI prior to the AHA session, it shows those clinical syndromes. After, they're not there. The person's responses are reflecting homeostasis, that those conversations are all together. I could go on, but that as a 30,000 foot overview is a combining of the activity initiated in or activated, sending the message, hey brain, would you engage in homeostasis and survive, and let's get to thrive. In the enteric nervous system, with interoception and that sensory somatic focus that is a function of the right anterior insular cortex, as identified by Craig, of interoception, and that is the result.
So let me interject here, because Scott, you know, you've had a few conversations now with Tom. Like, we originally met you because you were so gracious to us. We emailed you and said, would you come on our podcast? And you did.
Yes.
We were really shocked that you said yes. And then you ended up having a couple of conversations with Tom, and he's obviously talking to you about AHA. And as you can tell, he's extremely excited about this. It's a life work and a life passion, and I know Tom very well as a friend, and I know that the source of that excitement is because there is a real desire to help and heal people. I think that would be fair to say. But tell us about, you know, your first, like, what do you think when you first had a conversation? Because there's a lot, isn't it? Like, you know, when you first had a conversation with him about AHA, what do you think? But then you've had a few now, and there actually have been a few like, oh, actually this could be happening here. Mm-hmm. So do you want to kick us off and share your initial thoughts and what you're thinking now?
Okay, well, thanks for having me, and I have enjoyed our ongoing conversations about this. My initial thoughts are that, oh, well, this is interesting, you know, because I had been in touch with other practitioners of these kinds of therapies. I've known people who suffered from kind of post-traumatic stress disorders, and also these kinds of diffuse things that go into chronic fatigue syndrome that are very difficult to diagnose and could manifest themselves in one way or another, depending upon, peculiarities of history, of the person's history, and so forth, and just how little, or maybe the few options that are available for actually treating people like this. These are difficult conditions, and so that kind of paralleled with my interest in homeostasis. I come into this from a very, very different field. I mean, I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not a therapist of any kind. My main interest has been in studying social physiology of termite colonies, for God's sake. So the two approaches couldn't be more different, I think. But nevertheless, my experiences got me to thinking about homeostasis in a fairly intensive way. And when both of you were describing this, I thought, there's an interesting parallel there. So that's kind of the origin of it, and so that's basically it. I come from way out in left field compared to what you guys are, but nevertheless, there's something in there that's intriguing, and let's see if we can find some kind of connection between the two. That's that.
So let's talk a little bit about what's intriguing then. So what's intriguing about we've already had the conversations. What's intriguing to you? What would be one of the things that would be intriguing to you about as Tom's explained, what happens, what he does with AHA? Mm-hmm. Could you share? Just approaching that question from, my perspective as a physiologist who's interested in social insect colonies, I'd always been kind of, dissatisfied with what we call the cybernetic model of homeostasis. We've spoken about this in some of our previous conversations. I know, the idea that there's some kind of machine that's sitting somewhere in our bodies that regulates something, and that doesn't really apply to when you're talking about colonies of millions of social insects. I mean, where's the thermostat in a colony of social insects? And it doesn't exist. What's going on there, of course, is you have this incredibly complex set of interactions that go on between agents. In this case, of course, individual termites, and out of that comes, of course, the function of something. It's not an organism, but it behaves a lot like an organism. There's a name for it. It's called a superorganism. And trying to make that connection, kind of got me to delve fairly deeply into what is it that we mean by homeostasis. It's the cybernetic model that shows up in most physiology textbooks and so forth. And surely there's something more there. And then there's also some teaching experiences that I've had. We tend to fall very easily into what I call the anatomical fallacy. You have this system here, you have this system over there, you have the central nervous system, you have the autonomic nervous system, you have the enteric nervous system, and that doesn't quite encapsulate what's going on. And my favorite example of that is look at what happens to the lung or the heart. That's the cardiorespiratory system. You have this little box there. It's a system. But when you look at the actual function of the lung, for example, or even the heart, they're not only gas exchange devices, they're endocrine organs. They do all kinds of different things. And
and this comes back to this many little lives idea. You know, when you're talking about the many little lives, that just fits more really the ways that organisms function. And we're trained to think about, you know, enteric nervous systems, central nervous systems, all these other kinds of things, in part because that's what's in the textbooks, but in part also it makes it easier for us to think about these kinds of things, you know. So you know, coming back to this many little lives analogy, you know, when you're talking about the enteric nervous system doing this with the central nervous system and all those kinds of things, that's not broad enough, because every single cell in the body is tied in with information. You know, we think of the nerve cells as being the kind of logic gates of the nervous system, but as you've said, Tom, and this is a wonderful phrase, the glial cells are the kind of nannies of the neurons. I love that phrase. And you know, which is the more important? And you know, as you have pointed out, you know, the glial cells are probably as important in the function of networks of nerve cells as are the nerve cells themselves, and so we can't get away from that. So the entire organism basically is a kind of a nervous system. Of course, it's also a respiratory system. It's also a cardiovascular system. It's all digestive system. All these other kinds of things, you know. So it's difficult to draw a distinction between the nervous system and what's going on in the whole body itself. And when Tom was describing to me the theory behind AHA, or
yep.
Do I have it right?
Uh-huh.
Keep the acronyms correct. You know, it seemed to tap into that, I think, quite nicely. That's the intriguing connection. I think that's there. Now, Tom and I have had a couple of conversations about this. Some on this webinar or podcast, and some over lunch, and those have been quite deep and enjoyable, I thought. So I think I kind of understand the idea behind it a little bit better than I did when I first started talking to you guys. And I think the interesting point of difference here was, if you look at homeostasis, it's wrong. Well, one of the outcomes of the cybernetic approach to homeostasis is that if you have a state of health, that's homeostasis, and if you have a state of ill health, that's not homeostasis. But in fact, it's all homeostasis. Yes. You know, and you know, when you talk about something like cancer, for example, that's a fairly stark example. That's still a homeostatic system. And what describes homeostasis really is not the operation of some mechanism, but actually a state of persistence. And states can persist over time and be homeostatic. That's the very definition of a homeostatic system. But you may not have a healthy body, that is, if you have this alternate kind of homeostasis going on, as opposed to the homeostasis we associate with a healthy body. And so that's one thing. You know, it's all homeostatic. And as I understand the technique, what AHA is doing is you're coming in and you're changing the conversation of the many little lives. If you have, for example, someone who is suffering from PTSD, all right, that's a homeostatic system. It's held in persistence because of the particular suite of conversations between all the many little lives that comprise the body, right? And this, I think, is where you have to broaden what's sensory in the body and what's functional, because there's really no difference between the two. And so PTSD, it's a homeostatic system, but it's maintained in place by a particular set of conversations that are going on that are different from the set of conversations that went on to enable the persistence of the pre-PTSD body, right? And so what AHA is doing, as I understand it, is that you're coming in and you're changing the conscious awareness of all these conversations of the many little lives. And by doing that, what you're doing is you're enabling the person, the conscious being that's the person, is to come in and say, well, okay, let's change the conversation that's causing you to persist in that state. And people who suffer from these diseases, lots of diseases, they know the symptoms, right? They can experience the symptoms, but they don't know why. And the reason they don't know why is they don't understand or they're not aware, if you will, of what's going on in all the conversations in the many little lives. And this is where, fight or flight reactions and vagal nerve issues, sympathetic versus parasympathetic types of nervous systems, that usually goes on without much conscious awareness of what's going on. Where it rises to consciousness, it's kind of vague feeling of unease. No one really knows why. It can manifest itself in vaguely defined symptoms, of which PTSD is one. Different kinds of autoimmune issues or others, chronic fatigue syndrome, all those other kinds of things. The person is not consciously aware of that. And as I understand the rationale behind AHA, it's doing things to help bring those kinds of cryptic conversations that are going on among the many little lives of the body up into conscious awareness, with the hope that's bringing it to conscious awareness will enable the person to actually come in and maybe change the conversations back to what they were prior to whatever trauma has afflicted them. That's what I understand it to be. And that's where I think the connection with homeostasis comes in, not as a mechanism, but as a means of persistence of this assemblage of the organism that is the many little lives.
Yeah, and if I may, one of the quotes that I use very often, probably ad nauseum, is where you had said, homeostasis is life. Mm-hmm. And it's allowing life and the persistence, but life in the restoration of life. And that optimized. Yeah. Interesting, you bring up consciousness and awareness. Damasios have talked about interoception from the perspective of that is consciousness. I've jokingly said with Descartes is I think, therefore I am. Yeah. With interoception, I sense that I am. And in that sensing, I am. And so there is this very significant conscious listening in to the many little lives that are the cells, that are the organs, that are that incredibly complex, which is why Cannon came up with the term homeostasis to start with. It's just too complex. And that stable, steady state. And the regulation of that, but not from a mechanistic perspective. It's more like the extended organism that is the termite mound, for instance, attacked by the anteater. We're a termite mound, so to speak. We've got lots of organisms living within us. And we host them, and they can get sideways with one another. And with interoception, our consciousness entering into and observing, but allowing that natural conversation to reorganize itself that is at the heart of AHA, is we're not doing something to the brain and body mechanistically to get a result. We're simply observing the interaction and the conversation and letting it organize itself. And that combination of homeostasis and interoception is, I think, why the results, it's, if I could put it this way, it's not AHA that's producing the results, it's life and nature itself that is producing the desirable result, because that's life.
Yeah. You know, and you know, you mentioned consciousness, and this gets into some fairly deep issues here. You know, I'm not going to say that, well, I will say that consciousness is real. It's real really only to me, right? I'm the conscious being. The consciousness is mine. It's idiosyncratic. I cannot peer into the consciousness of any other human being, never mind the consciousness of our cats or our dog, which I'm sure are conscious in ways similar to how I am conscious. I can't even conceive of what the consciousness of a termite colony is going to be, right? But maybe it's there. I don't know. So I prefer to think about this whole thing as not so much consciousness, but cognition. And when I say that every cell in the body, and even extending beyond the body, we are cognitive systems. You know, when you talk about the nervous system, right? Well, probably consciousness is coming in there somewhere, but really the problem with having a nervous system is that it's one of many different cognitive systems. Every cell in the body is a cognitive system, and that's where these conversations that are at the heart of the many little lives idea come from. Every cell is aware, not necessarily in a conscious way, but in a cognitive way of what's going on around it. It can manipulate conversations with other cognitive systems out there, and the problem is how those cognitive systems channel things up to our conscious awareness, you know, and this is where I say consciousness is real. To me, it's absolutely real, because otherwise I just wouldn't, you know, be having this conversation, so to speak. But it's broader than that. And we have no idea how cognition translates into consciousness, right? But that doesn't mean that you cannot come in and manipulate the cognition of the many little lives and bring it up into conscious awareness, you know, because we're consciously aware of something, but we may not be consciously aware of all the cognitive conversations that are going on, right? And so I think that's probably at the heart of the logic behind AHA. You know, you are taking things that are cognitive systems that are contributing to whatever PTSD or any of these other kinds of problems, and you're bringing it up into conscious awareness in a way that ordinarily it wouldn't happen. So you still have a homeostatic system in PTSD as an example, and you have a homeostatic system in the pre-PTSD system, and one hopes after one's able to resolve that. But the novel thing to me about AHA, and the thing that I find intriguing, is that you're coming in and you're changing the conversations that control how those conversations arise into consciousness. And once they're in the level of consciousness, then you can take conscious and deliberate steps to actually reverse them. That's what I understand AHA to be.
Yeah, I think that for me, when like last time we talked, one of the things for me was like that I found a little bit mind blowing was this idea of understanding disease or health, like, and seeing it as a conversation. Like, I just like thought that was brilliant. Like, to think, oh my gosh, there's a conversation happening within my body, and it can be either very healthy, or there can be parts of it that are dominated by something, and it's all homeostatic, but what I want to do if I want to achieve wellness and health is to have a conversation that's healthy, right? And but so for me that was a really helpful picture. And I don't think we see disease like that very much, Scott. I was thinking about just a number of different people last week or a couple of weeks ago when we had the conversation, and even how people kind of describe cancer, for example. They're like, I'm going to fight cancer, and it's like, well, actually it's part of it's really part of our body. And so for me, the approach of let's change the conversation feels like an integrative approach to ourselves, and to be able to then think the next step of, oh my gosh, AHA is almost like giving us a way to be conscious of the conversation and therefore be able to empower it into the right space. I had a situation not long ago where I did an AHA session, and I just had a lot of dental work, and it was quite, I don't know if you. I'm not a fan of the dentist, but it's always very intrusive, isn't it? And I had 4 hours of dental work, and I thought it would be fine, and I got through it, and that was great. But the next 3 or 4 nights, I literally could not sleep. Like it was like my body was on high alert or something like that, and I was just and I like my mind wanted to sleep, but my body was not. It was like vigilant. So I talked to Tom about it, and I was like, Tom, I don't know what's happening. Like, and we had a little conversation about it, but I did a very short AHA session where I paid attention, I activated, I paid attention to what was happening, where I was feeling something in my body. And then through that process, I remember, and I won't go into all the details, but I remember saying to my conscious self, I choose to sleep. Like something's telling me I shouldn't sleep, but I want to say to the conversation, to my many little lives, that this is safe. It's okay. I don't have to be on guard. I want to rest and recover now. And so we did I did a little AHA session, and I slept really well. And so I mentioned that because it really, for me, was, and I've done AHA many times now, but for me, I'm almost seeing it more now from our conversations of like, oh, I get to change the conversation. There's an unhealthy conversation that's happening within me, and I understand that. I can have empathy for that. Yeah. But I can also know that this isn't healthy for me, so I need to change the conversation. Yeah. So I don't know what you think about that, but I just thought it was a little example.
Yeah. I mean, it's if what I'm saying is anywhere close to the truth of the way living things work, the whole thing of the body, its state, is a result of a whole suite of conversations, as I said, conversations between cognitive entities, much of which goes on outside the realm of our conscious awareness of it. And so your description of being in a particular state where you consciously wanted to sleep but couldn't, that's a whole set of conversations between the pineal, between subcortical parts of your brain, between pain receptors in the periphery, and all these other kinds of things. They were dominating the conversation, and I don't want to say that consciousness can cure anything, because it can't. You sometimes need interventions to be able to take care of these things, but eventually you can change those conversations, as you said, as you've just described, and so that's so that is very consistent with what we're saying, and I don't know. I want to bring up French scientist his name is Michel Cabanach. I'm sure he's long dead by now, but it was kind of an influential paper for me, or concept for me. My background started off very much in the cybernetic model of homeostasis. I was interested in temperature regulation, in particular temperature regulation of animals that supposedly aren't supposed to be able to do that, like reptiles and things like that. And this paper that he published, the title was Thermal Comfort. And he made the point that, okay, well, suppose you're very cold and you come into a warm room. You feel very comfortable when you do that. You get a very strong sense of pleasure when that happens. But very quickly, the sense of pleasure wears away, right? It goes away. and when you think about it that way, homeostasis is not so much the operation of a machine. Temperature regulation is not so much the operation of a thermostat embedded somewhere in your brain, but it's actually a sense of comfort or well-being or all the kinds of things that go into that kind of sense. And what motivates someone to actually go and find a warm room is the anticipation of this sense of comfort when you go in, a very pleasurable sense of comfort, which eventually goes away once you're there and you're all fine, right? And so that's an example of the kind of dynamic nature of homeostasis in this case, right? And an example of the role that conscious awareness plays in all this. And the connection to things like regulation of temperature in reptiles, there's no heater inside the body of a reptile. There's no air conditioning system in the body of a reptile. None of the machines that go into regulating our own temperature. But really, when you look at how reptiles regulate their body temperature, they do. They even have fevers. But it's not so much an operation of a thermostat that's regulating the heaters and the air conditioners and all these other kinds of things. It's actually a cognitive state for these creatures, and that was kind of the one of the breakthroughs for me in getting away from the cybernetic model of homeostasis. It's very much a cognitive state, right? And we happen to have consciousness that takes an assessment of all the cognitive states that are going on inside the body, and we've become aware of it, right? And just like this measure or this doctrine of thermal comfort, it brings that whole set of conversations into conscious awareness. As I understand it, that's what AHA does for other kinds of things, and it enables, people to get back to a state that they like, right?
Yeah,
right?
If I may, I mentioned about the mental health issues, the mental issues, stress, anxiety, depression, anger, things like that. But people are also reporting medical conditions. And I've done AHA with a few doctors, and how they wind up with me is they've had some of their patients going, "You're better? Well, wait, that's not supposed to have been happening. It hadn't been happening, and yet here it is." And that's the brain. And I use that in quotation because most people will think of that one organ in the head, but there is also the same cells that make that up in the enteric nervous system. And and you've talked and written about brain in many different states, which I would love to get to. But my point is, I've had a lot of people like Crohn's disease. It's better. It's remediated.
Yeah.
And no longer having to take immunosuppressants because the brain is doing that. It's regulating that. I could go on with all sorts of medical conditions. A condition I had was neurocardiogenic syncope. vasovagal syncope, that if my flight or fight because of prior trauma was triggered too extensively, I literally would pass out. Had an interesting episode as a minister of this is way decades ago, making a pastoral call on this little old lady who was in the hospital bed, and I passed out and wound up on the floor. Long story. My point is, and she was such a dear, she looked over and said, "Pastor, are you okay?" I said, "Yeah, but I'm supposed to be the one comforting you. Thank you." But it drove me to get a sense of there has to be a way. And biology, life itself provides that way. And I no longer have that condition. I don't have neurocardiogenic syncope, dysautonomia frequently. And that's a whole category of things. People reporting I don't have that condition. Tics, all sorts of. Anyway, my point is body, mind, all integrated, holistic connections, but these conversations are happening. And there is a cognition that we can listen into, participate in, where, as I like to say, the brain is the therapist, the brain is the doctor, and can achieve all sorts of things that, in terms of the conversations, are now functional, holistic conversations that are beneficial rather than the conversations that are dysfunctional and disruptive.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I don't want to minimize the role of pharmacological interventions.
No, not at all.
Especially when you're talking about things like monoclonal antibody therapies, which actually target a very specific part of what's going on there. But of course, the immune system is another one of these cognitive systems that's I think is as complex as the nervous system. Not to make the anatomical fallacy on my own part, but these kinds of interventions can work, and if they're targeted specifically enough, they could work very well. But there are some dangers there, obviously, as we all know. That doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of interventions that can be done and that can be very effective. And, certainly things like Crohn's disease or a lot of autoimmune things, they're often tied up with other kinds of disorders like anxiety disorders, other kinds of personality attributes that are aspects of these conversations of the many little lives. And so if you have something like Crohn's disease, you can target very specifically, what receptor is being overactivated is causing the lining of the gut to degrade in a particular way. But that doesn't mean there aren't other ways of doing it, because, it really is all a big network of cognitive interactions between the many little lives, the organs, cells, whatever, that comprise the body. So my feeling is, okay, you have all this wonderful medicine that's dripping into the oil, could really be effective, but that doesn't mean we stop there. That's not the only way of approaching
Such a great conversation, both of you. I've learned a lot through it, and it's a journey, isn't it, of discovery, and
it is,
and working with many different interventions. But I'm grateful for AHA, Tom, and your work, and I'm grateful for you, Scott, to just shed some light on it from coming from a very different field, but just giving some light to what may be happening in that space. So really appreciate you guys.
Oh, absolutely.
And we'll get back to another conversation another time.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Homeostasis Activation Podcast. Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom.
If you're interested in pursuing your own wellness journey, please check out our website, autonomichealing.org.
You can also reach out to Tom at innerworkings.org.